I want to welcome Dr. Sean Carroll, a theoretical physicist and I guess theoretical philosopher as well. Thank
Like
you
all
for
the
coming
best
on to my
philosophers,
channel once
yeah.
again.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right, we're here to discuss comments made by intelligent design creationist Dr. Stephen Meyer when he was on TV with Piers Morgan a couple months back, and we'll tune into that.
Well, your best-selling book, new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, you argue there are three big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang Theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God?
Well, right. Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence.
Stephen Meyer is going to dive into the evidence. How much you want to bet that he doesn't get around to any actual factual evidence for any of the points he's trying to make in this interview? How much you want to bet that instead all we will get is misunderstood, misleading, misinformation, misrepresented, deliberately deceptively?
Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were true.
It is best to weigh multiple hypotheses at once without necessarily committing to any of them, considering that, well, maybe that's true and maybe it isn't, just to see which ones are better supported by the most reliable evidence, like evolution is, and which hypotheses are entirely unsupported, like the notion of God is, or worse, which ones are overwhelmingly contradicted by both logic and evidence, like creationism is. If you're a scientist, then a position that is unsupported isn't really even worthy of further consideration, much less discussion. Now, such a topic would only come up if you're not used to marijuana but decided to try some anyway. However, if you believe things on faith, then it doesn't matter that you don't have any evidence whatsoever to support your many assumptions, onto which you compile other assumptions, all of them baseless. And it doesn't matter to you how many facts and evidence contradict your assumptions either. You'll still make believe in whatever you want to believe in, even when there is no good reason to believe that, and a wealth of reasons not to, including some very good reasons to dismiss it as false. None of that will matter to you if you base your position on faith in arguments from an erroneously assumed authority instead of evidence. On this point, I agree with Carl Sagan that arguments from authority are worthless. Whatever is inconsistent with the facts, no matter how fond of it we are, must be discarded or revised.
And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes.
Believers desperately want to pretend that everything happens for a reason, which is fair, but they refuse to accept that the reason may be chemical processes or natural physics, things that were obviously not deliberately intended, nor needed to be, nor even possibly could have been. There's never been any mechanism ever proposed for how this asserted assumption of God does anything, other than PFM, pure freaking magic. Incantation, transformations, and in the case of the first man, a golem spell. Which is why creationists like Meyer contrast the material with the immaterial. It's another way to distinguish the physical from the magical, between the real world and the world of pure imagination, in which the spirit allegedly dwells, though we know that spirits or souls and that sort of thing don't exist either. And when they complain about science and reality being strictly material, they are complaining that there's no place left to imagine just a little magic in there somewhere.
And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal self-existent universe, one that had been here for an infinitely long time and therefore did not need an external creator. What in fact the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself.
Is that what you guys found? Evidence of a definite beginning where the universe was created, reportedly externally and apparently out of nothing, such that it could not come about through natural, non magical means, but only by a supernatural conjuration? Is that what you guys discovered?
So the short answer is no. The longer answer is pretty long. I'm going to try to bite my tongue a little bit because there's too many things to say here. I think that Professor Meyer would do well to take advice from Georges Lemaitre, who was the Belgian priest and physicist who helped pioneer the Big Bang model, which he called the primeval atom. And as a priest, he was invited to be on various commissions by the Pope. And the Pope said, "Oh, this is great. Now that we have the Big Bang Theory, that's evidence that God exists, just like we've been saying all along." And Lemaitre says, "Please don't say that. You can't say that because progress in science might very well change our minds about that someday. And then you're going to have to undo all the claims that you were making." The fact is, the Big Bang is very well entrenched in our current best cosmological understanding of the universe, but we don't know what happened at the Big Bang. We don't know whether it was the beginning of the universe or not. It might very well have been. I have no troubles with that. There's nothing whatsoever in the laws of physics that requires that time must be infinite toward the future and the past. But it still could have been. There's been plenty of very plausible models of cosmology that have the universe being eternal. If it's not eternal, that does not mean that we require a creator to explain it. It's just like saying a circle is finite in size. It doesn't mean it has a beginning or an end, right? There's the question is, can you come up with a theory of the universe that obeys the laws of physics, that explains the beginning of the universe, its earliest moments, in purely physical terms? And the answer to that is no problem at all. Like, we don't know what the right one is, like I just said, but there's no obstacle whatsoever to us finding a theory that explains it perfectly self contained.
So if the universe had a beginning, there are a number of explanations that don't require that we throw up our hands and call for the supernatural.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And the other thing that is very important to say within this particular question is it's completely cherry picking for theists to say, well, the naturalists thought the universe would last forever. There's nothing about the Big Bang cosmology and the modern scientific picture that looks like anything that was predicted by any religious tradition before the 20th century. God could easily have told us that in the Bible that the universe is a few billion years old, right? Since the Big Bang. He didn't tell us that. There's no match whatsoever between what the theists expected the universe to look like and what we found in 20th century cosmology.
And likewise, you said there are also several models. I think you said at one point that there were dozens of models for the universe that is eternal.
Yeah, because we don't know what happened at the Big Bang, you're welcome to ask, is it plausible? Is it conceivable? Is it consistent with what we understand about the laws of physics? That there was a pre existing universe before the Big Bang that evolved into ours? And the answer is yes. We have many different models that are like that. We don't know which, if any of them, are right. But that's how science works. You know, you make hypotheses and then you compare them with the data and you try to improve your understanding.
Because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing.
No, I'm told that there was never a time when there was no material energy in the universe. The very first law of thermodynamics holds that material energy cannot be created or destroyed. So there's no reason to assume that it ever was created or destroyed. The evidence already says that it wasn't, and material energy is therefore eternal. So can we at least understand that if a thing was never created at all, having already always existed, then there was never a need for it to create itself or to be created externally either? It's already there. No creation necessary.
Again, we don't know whether the universe is eternal or not. We don't even know what the laws of physics are in their final form, right? So we're really trying to understand all of these things at once. There's a lot of very subtle issues here that should be it's unsurprising to us that they're subtle because we're talking about the nature of the universe itself. We're not talking about things that are familiar from our experiences in the kitchen or something like that. One thing is that it's very plausible that the total amount of energy in the universe is exactly zero. This is actually a prediction of Einstein's theory of general relativity if you live in a universe which is closed. That is to say, if space is finite and closes in on itself. So if that's true, then you can both have conservation of energy and a non-eternal universe. We don't know that it's true. We don't know the universe is closed. We don't know that Einstein's theory of general relativity is exactly right. So maybe energy is conserved and non-zero, and therefore the universe is eternal, but maybe not on all of those counts. So again, I think the game one should try to play is not try to come up with ironclad principles and do deductive reasoning from them, is to come up with models, hypotheses, theories about what the universe could be like, and ask whether they are compatible with other things we know, both data and theoretically. For the eternity of the universe, it might very well be eternal or finite. None of that means, and this is super duper important, that anything had to create it. And again, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that because these universes don't get created in our kitchen or our laboratories. The idea that there was something before the universe that either created or evolved into the universe is not the idea that modern physics suggests to us. When we say that the universe had a beginning, the right way to phrase that is there is a moment prior to which there are no moments. There is a first moment in the history of the universe. But because of that, because there's literally no universe, no reality earlier than that, you shouldn't say that this nothingness created the universe. There was no nothingness. There wasn't anything.
Okay, so that confuses me a little bit because that,
Like I said.
well, because it was my understanding that every model of cosmogony that like we go back to classical physics, then we have a singularity, right? And then the singularity exists at the very first moment. So understandably, we don't ever start from nothing, and the only reason we would have nothing before the Big Bang would be for the same reason that we have nothing south of the South Pole. It's a conceptual failure. But then that's only in these models, and that's what I was referring to. Obviously, when I'm talking about the first law of thermodynamics, I'm talking about classical physics, which is where these people that I'm addressing are certainly coming from. They're not talking about quantum, right? But I've been saying forever that we don't believe there was ever a time when there was just nothing.
You see, the problem there is not the substance of what you're saying, but the words in which you're saying it. You say, there was not a time when there was nothing. Well, that's true because even time didn't exist before the universe existed. The right way to say it is, or to ask the question is there an earliest or first moment in the history of the universe? And the answer is we don't know.
Okay, so in the dozens of models that you're talking about, that first moment was actually preceded by an earlier state of the universe.
In those models, there is no first moment. Time goes on forever in both directions.
Okay, and that's where I'm sitting. So I know that some people had suggested, many years ago, from my perspective, it was many years ago that somebody had suggested, and I think I even heard you say that the universe could have created itself essentially from nothingness, but that's certainly not a belief. That's not what we hold to, as is so often recorded. The last time we talked, I complained about how I'm told almost every day that as an atheist, I have to believe that everything came from nothing. And so I correct these people daily, and I get really tired of that one thing all the time.
Well, what I'm trying to steer people away from is using this language of being created from nothing. That's just a mistake. It's what you're trying to say is that the universe had an earliest moment. In some models, it has an earliest moment. It is finite in time to the past. In other models, it does not have an earliest moment. It is infinite in time to the past. We just don't know. What we do know is it is conceptually incoherent to talk about an absence of universe creating anything. But that's okay. We don't need to talk about that. We can just talk about whether or not the universe has a boundary in time.
Additionally, physicists have a very different concept of causation than creationists do.
Yeah, again, this gets very subtle. Philosophers have written many, many books about the nature of causation, going back to at least Aristotle, if not before that, and we don't necessarily agree on what's going on. There was this idea, really going back to before physics as we know it, right? So before classical mechanics or anything like that, the principle of sufficient reason. From Gottfried Leibniz, who says that for anything that happens, there is a cause or a reason why it happens. Modern science has changed that point of view, as we should not be surprised. That's a philosophical idea from hundreds of years ago. We don't, in modern physics, talk a language of causes and effects. We talk a language of laws of physics. We say that there's a state of the universe or some subsystem of the universe, and there are laws of physics that relate the state of the universe at one time to the state of the universe before or after. And maybe that is a deterministic relationship, maybe it's probabilistic. We don't know. There's many things we don't know. But I think that in a lot of people's minds who don't understand physics, if you say we don't have causation in the traditional sense, they think, oh, that means anything goes, anything can happen. William Lane Craig has very explicitly said, if you think the universe can just be created without a cause, why don't bicycles pop into existence without a cause? The answer is because that would violate the laws of physics. But the universe having an earliest moment would not violate the laws of physics. Therefore, stop talking about causes when it comes to the universe itself.
I love the quote from Carl Sagan where he says, well, where did the universe come from? The natural answer or the common answer is that it comes from a God. Well, why not save a step and just say, if God is eternal, then why can't the universe be eternal? Yeah. But I tried to use that in one of my videos and got blocked for copyright. which is also why I'm glad that you accepted the invitation to come on here, because in the this is a remake video. The earlier version of it ran afoul of some people because it was including copyrighted material.
Right.
So thank you for allowing me to do this revision, because it does cover some important points. And even if some of the things that I say that when I'm pontificating on well outside of my field, I still want to include them, right or wrong, because I think that they are important, and people are certainly welcome to critique them as they will.
And so the picture of the universe that has emerged starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
Your argument is that the universe had a beginning, therefore God? There's so much wrong with this. First of all, the baseless assumption of an external cause is apparently irrelevant, if not inapplicable. And more importantly, it's unnecessary, as there is no definite beginning.
He does say that. And, it's interesting that the neither part of that statement is true. Certainly, neither part of that statement is backed up by what physicists think. He wants to use physicist stories about cosmology when it suits his purpose. But the physicists don't think that if there's a Big Bang, then that implies that God exists. Most physicists are atheists. And, once again, we have to be realistic and humble enough to admit what we don't know and what we don't, what we do know and what we don't. We know that around 14 billion years ago, the universe was in a hot, dense, pretty smooth, rapidly expanding state. We know that if classical general relativity were correct, that would imply a singularity at early times, a moment when the curvature and the density of matter were all infinite. We also know that classical general relativity is not correct because it doesn't have quantum mechanics in it. We don't know what actually happened at that moment. We know that our theory breaks down and we need to replace it with something better. So if you can come up with, it's just a matter of construction. Like if someone has a proof that 2 + 2 cannot equal 4, and then I actually just add up 2 and get 4, then I win. Their proof must be mistaken somehow. If I could come up with a theory in which the universe simply obeys the laws of physics and is perfectly self-contained, then all of the claiming in the world that I need God to do it doesn't matter. I don't need God to do it. I just did it. That doesn't mean that that theory is correct, but it certainly means that I don't require God to do the explanatory lifting.
I like how you're talking about that we need to come up with a theory And of course, it's all got to be, it's a mathematics theory, so it is something that has to be devised, and we're working out what the properties are, because this is a reality that we're trying to understand, not something that we're trying to invent. We're just trying to match it with reality. And what we are talking about ultimately is a quantum theory of gravity, as opposed to like relativity, and then which was a revision or an enhancement of Newton's theory of gravity. And why I find all of that so fascinating is because when I started out as an activist against creationism, I was going against the Texas State Board of Education, who universally declared that gravity is not a theory, it's a law. That's our Board of Education statewide.
Right. This is why I don't take philosophy or science lessons from boards of education. I once wrote a whole blog post about the fact that scientists, unlike certain commentators, don't draw any distinctions between the words theory, model, hypothesis, or law. There's just no outside external reality that you have to conform to when you use those words. We have something called Newton's law of gravitation, but we know it's not right. We have something called the standard model of particle physics, which is right as far as we can tell in a very wide variety of circumstances. We have the past hypothesis in cosmology. That seems to be absolutely correct. So these words just don't have those meanings you want them to have. To say gravity is not a theory, it's a law, is just absolutely meaningless at a scientific or philosophical level.
Dawkins is obviously one of the world's most famous atheists. Are you a believer in God yourself?
I do believe in God.
Come on, Piers, you already knew that he claimed evidence for God in his most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis, from which you are right now waiting for him to dive into alleged evidence for God that was supposed to be in that book, and that his earlier book, Signature of the Cell, refers to God supposedly signing his name to his creations, if you're deep enough into conspiratorial assumptions of pareidolia, imagining patterns that aren't really there. And he just said that he was opposed to Dawkins on the topic of atheism. And don't pretend you don't know whether Stephen Meyer believes in God, or don't pretend that wasn't already obvious to everyone.
Yes. Okay, so let's play a clip from Dawkins on this show.
Yes.
So why is it not possible that there is a superior being, power, which many people believe in different ways?
It's possible there are
different
fairies
types
at the bottom of the garden. I mean, all sorts of things are possible. You can't deny that.
Well, except I've never seen fairies in the garden, have you?
No, you've never seen God either.
No, but you don't know for sure that either doesn't exist.
No, I don't know that fairies don't exist. Fairies may be leprechauns, for all I know.
The point of that was, is there any good reason to believe in any of these things? And the answer is no, there isn't. People simply make believe in some of these things for emotional reasons that I can't begin to relate to. There's no need for it. And instead of reversing the burden of proof and asking why it's not possible that there is a God, why not show you how your God is possible? And notice that you can't do that. But if you could, then of course you would also have to show that your God is probable, which you can't do that either. And then beyond that, you'd have to show sufficient reason to conclude that your God is evidently real, and not just something that you can only make believe on faith.
My big question for all atheists, is, okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started?
Assuming that any understanding of the Big Bang is correct at all, then it was apparently a prior state.
In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing?
There was never a time when there was just nothing. And don't you remember the theme song for the TV show?
The whole universe was in a hot, dense state.
The whole universe. Space-time, material energy, all of it. That's everything, not nothing.
Nearly 14 billion years ago, expansion started.
So from everything super hot and packed in, it expands to become everything cooled down and spread out. At no point was there just nothing. And this is one of the straw man projections creationists constantly recite that I find the most annoying, when they pretend as if atheists believe that everything came from nothing, when we don't. I don't know anyone who believes that. I don't know if I've ever met anyone who believes that, other than creationists, of course. They're the ones who really do believe in creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. Because the Bible says that God called into existence things that did not exist. Abracadabra, poof, everything out of nothing.
What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word.
That's why when Lawrence Krauss published his book, A Universe from Nothing, he had to redefine nothing such that nothing became something, just so that he could have a snazzy book title that would sell and be talked about. Even though the title is tongue-in-cheek, Krauss never believed that a universe came from absolute nothingness.
What is nothingness?
You might think of nothingness as a void, a huge open space that is absolutely empty. But open space is not nothing. A quantum vacuum is not nothing. An absolute philosophical nothing would not even be a void. It would be the ultimate in non-existence, infinite in its nothingness. If there were ever an absolute philosophical nothingness, then we wouldn't be talking about it because we would be nothing. It couldn't be that there is an absolute philosophical nothingness here and something somewhere else. An absolute philosophical nothingness requires that there be no thing anywhere, not empty space, not even a God. It would be the ultimate in non-existence, where no one or no thing ever existed and never would or could. If a God exists, then existence exists. You can't have existence and non-existence coexist, because non-existence doesn't exist, which is a double negative, meaning that something exists. Okay, well, that's still correct. If a God existed, and that God is past eternal, then existence is past eternal. If a God exists outside of our universe, then existence is still a thing, and our universe becomes a place that exists within that larger realm. Even if it is just a quantum vacuum, which is still something, not no thing. Now, if a God exists, and it is eternal, then the universe should be eternal too. But that's not what believers believe. They believe that God existed eternally, sitting on his thumbs forever, until he finally got an idea to create everything so that he would have something to do besides play with himself. What else is there? So the faithful believe that God is eternal, but somehow they think that the universe is not, because they think that it had a beginning, which implies that it would also have an end, but only for physical things. Our immortal souls would be eternal, and so we would still have to endure the inescapable ultimate monotony of relentless eternity. Well, there's no way to just let it end. There's just no point to that. But now understand that even if there is no God, existence still exists because we exist, which means that existence has always existed. Even if things were different way back when, and existence will always exist, even if it ultimately ends up in heat death. Because just as you cannot call existence into existence from non-existence, you also can't make existence not exist anymore. If you're talking about an eternity, then even a span of 20 billion years will eventually seem like a flash in the pan. And maybe it was. But if it was, it wasn't the only one. If there was ever a singularity at all, which there might not have been with the theory of quantum gravity, then that singularity wouldn't be sitting around forever until it suddenly inflated a universe which then cooled into bits of scattered dust. You wouldn't have eternity with a spark, then 20 billion years of cosmic inflation followed by an eternity with nothing but smoke. No. This is the sort of thing that happens over and over again, if it ever happens at all. If the universe doesn't collapse on itself, starting the cycle all over again, then maybe other universes blast into this one on occasion, every 15 to 20 billion years or so. Who knows? Can another universe intrude on this one, inflating space-time all over again? If that ever happened before, I mean. Maybe a previous Big Bang happened inside the same universe, but further out than we can still see. How would we know? We can only see so far. And we only found out about the cosmic inflation 100 years ago. How much more will we learn about it in the next 100 years? Is there a cyclic oscillation? Perhaps. I don't know. I don't think anybody does.
And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened, because we can't.
You can't, Piers, because you're not a smart person. I could probably explain this to other people, but not to you. Your argument is that you don't know, therefore magic. That's already illogically fallacious. But worse, you assume that if the universe started at all, then whatever started it must have had a conscious mind with comprehension. Why would you assume those things? There's no indication of that. See, I like to think that I'm a pretty smart guy, but I went to an amazing meeting, the amazing meeting in Las Vegas, where I listened to Lawrence Krauss give a lecture on a universe from nothing, wherein he said that in his particular view, the universe did not come from absolutely nothing, but a quantum vacuum, which is something, not nothing. So he presented nothing. Well, actually, he presented something that he called nothing, and he said that his explanation or redefinition of nothing would probably confuse people. I had to concur, because at the end I realized that I'm confused by nothing. Wait, that sounds like nothing confuses me. I mean, that I'm not confused. Well, I had to admit that Lawrence Krauss understands nothing. Wait, that sounds like he doesn't understand anything. What I'm trying to say is that he understands nothing better than I do. Right, that makes it sound like I understand everything better than he does. Well, you understand what I mean. No, you don't. You're Piers Morgan. You don't understand anything. If it makes you feel better, you could say that you understand nothing better than Krauss does. Because if misunderstood in the right way, then that could be true.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies.
Because it literally is.
And he'll concede that, well, it's possible.
But it's really not. I disagree with Dawkins here in that fairies, gods, and leprechauns are not possible. One, because before we can say that anything is possible, there must be a precedent or a parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. You don't have that. Not for God, not for fairies, not for leprechauns. So there is not even a possibility to consider. And two, because physics and biology do not allow any of these things. They're all literally magical, and magic isn't real, which is why each of these things are only known from fantasy folklore, because that's all any of them really are. I know there is no God. I know that to the same degree and for the same reasons that I know there are no leprechauns.
But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest.
But you don't have an explanation. You're proposing an invisible man, essentially a genie, using magic words to speak things into existence out of nothing. When, one, you haven't shown any indication that your favorite fantasy phantasm even could exist, and then two, no mechanism for how your imagined magician could actually do anything, and three, nothing evidently ever came into existence out of nothing. No, wait. Nothing can come from nothing, so it would be more correct to say that that there were no things that ever came into existence from non-existence. There you go. So your best explanation is actually the worst explanation. Actually, it's worse than even that, because it's not an explanation at all. Gods and magic don't explain anything. But probably the most important point is 4. You're not reasoning from evidence. You said when a scientist reasons from evidence, you're not reasoning from evidence. You're rationalizing from faith in lieu of evidence, and even in spite of evidence to the contrary.
And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
No. I'm told that there was never a time when there was no material energy in the universe. I don't know myself personally. I'm not a cosmologist. This isn't my field at all. I'm more of an anthropologist, a taxonomist. I neither know nor care whether the universe had a beginning. Either way is irrelevant to me, because it would not change the fact that we are evolving apes, and that all of the scriptures of every religion are man-made mythology with no significant truth in any of them, nor even in all of them combined. But every model of cosmogony that I know of includes a singularity, which precedes cosmic inflation, and that singularity also includes material energy. I remember some physicists saying that energy can be slowed down to become matter. Think about the fourth state of matter. At its coldest, any material is solid. Heat it up and you can melt it into a liquid. Heat that up and it'll become gas. Heat that up another 1,000,000 degrees or so, and you get plasma of the sort that you find in the core of the sun. Pure radioactive heat, from which any chemical element can be constructed from hydrogen and ejected as whatever else. Conversely, solid matter can be sped up to become energy, like with a nuclear explosion, which again produces plasma, albeit only for an instant. Either one of these are analogous to the state of matter in the singularity which precedes the moment of cosmic inflation. In some models, that singularity already existed before time began, and in some models, that singularity is itself a product of a big crunch of a prior form of the universe, one in which the arrow of entropy may have pointed the other way. So while a few scientists have carelessly said that the universe was created by the Big Bang, they're talking about the formation of the universe as we know it now, which may have been made out of an earlier form, not ex nihilo, not out of nothing. And I don't subscribe to that myself because, one, I'm not a cosmologist. I don't have access to the data. I don't have an understanding of the data that cosmologists should. But I have heard that black holes are literally holes in the fabric of space-time. What's on the other side of those holes? Are the only holes made from this side through to another side? Or can, say, a fourth-dimensional cosmic membrane inflate three-dimensional space with an appearance similar to like when you scan a three-dimensional object by a means that only has the capacity of interpreting two dimensions? Like running an MRI. That would give the false impression of something coming from nothing when we know, in fact, it did not. I think it actually would be more like when you see bubbles forming in the bottom of a saucepan coming to boil. It looks like those bubbles are popping into existence out of nothing, though we know that they're not. That's just liquid becoming gas. So would a singularity be like a fifth state of matter, either caused by the collapse of a prior universe or inflating this universe from an external source like a multiverse, such that every bubble in the bottom of that saucepan is its own universe? Whatever the explanation is, as I said, I don't know and I don't care, but it wasn't a magic invisible man saying abracadabra or let there be. I don't think we'll ever figure out the origin of the universe as we know it, certainly not within my lifetime anyway. But I think it important to remember what I've said a few times before. You have to remember that once upon a time, our ancestors believed that thunder, lightning, and volcanoes were gods in action, that comets were an omen, that the stars and planets had human characteristics, and that sickness was a curse of witchcraft, and that epilepsy was demonic possession, all because that's what these religions would have us believe. And in each case, the real truth might never have been discovered had we been satisfied by those lies. And in each case, the reality was a revelation of whole new fields of study previously unimagined and vastly more complex than the simple excuses made up in our ignorance. And no doubt that pattern will continue, such that if we ever do discover the cause of the Big Bang or some better explanation for the origin of life, the universe, and everything, it too will be a wealth of new information with practical application and so advanced that it will render our previous belief in gods and ghosts and magic just as laughably silly as every other field of study so far has already shown.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient.
I mean, this is just kind of a word salad going on here. There's an implicit idea that things have to be caused by other things that are prior to them in time. That's not necessarily true. There's another explicit idea that we need to have causes for things, which is not true in this sense, applied to this particular kind of thing. There's a wonderful quote that is bandied around by Bertrand Russell in the early 1900s. And it's not that he's necessarily right, but just to point out that philosophers and physicists have understood this for over a century now. He says the notion of cause much like the British monarchy, is an outdated thing that is only kept around because it is erroneously believed to do little harm. But we don't talk the language of cause and effect in fundamental science anymore. It works fine for, explaining why you're late to work someday. I'm late to work because the roads were icy. That's fine. That doesn't mean that those notions need to make sense when you apply them to the overall theory of why the universe exists at all.
The reason the roads are iced is because our new neighbor is a witch.
That could be.
So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well.
But logically, if God exists outside of the bounds of time, then at no time does he exist. If God exists outside of our reality, then he does not exist in reality.
The theists, I want to reiterate, had their chance. They had every opportunity in the world to explicate what kind of cosmological theory God would have preferred. Typically, what did they do? They ended up with theories where the Earth is at the center of the universe, and the universe was created 6,000 years ago. It makes no sense whatsoever to look at modern cosmology and say, oh, look, finally we do exactly what theism said we should be doing all along. I prefer the scientific way of thinking about this, which is always provisional, fallibilistic, testing hypotheses. We have a very good understanding of what's been going on for the last 14 billion years, since a few seconds or minutes after the Big Bang. And we admit that we don't know what happened before then. We don't have any direct data. Our theories aren't very good. So let's just do the scientific thing. We don't need any God to explain it. We're going to propose hypotheses. We're going to see how far it gets us. And this tendency for theists to say, well, unless you already know the answer, we're going to have to conclude that God did it, is entirely unconvincing to me.
I'm trying to imagine if there was ever a situation, ever in the history of mankind, where material explanations proved to be insufficient. We can't use immaterial explanations because that means the supernatural. Anytime you use the word supernatural in a sentence, I think you could probably replace that word with the word magical or imaginary and not change the quality of your sentence. Material explanations, i.e. physics, are what all physicists must use, even religious physicists, including the ones who hold to cosmological models in which there is no beginning.
Giordano Bruno said that, look, the universe has billions of stars with separate worlds around them. And the theists could have said, oh, yes, that's exactly what we expect in our religious view of the world. But they didn't. They burnt him at the stake. I think that we should have learned better than that by now. These words that are borrowed from Aristotle and Aquinas are not the way to think about modern physics.
Dr. Sean Carroll, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks for having me.
And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes that traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and therefore can initiate a change of state from, in this case, nothing to something.
So you made up an imaginary character, one who is bigger than big and stronger than strong and older than time and all that, exaggerating in every direction at once to the nth degree, beyond bounds, everywhere, just making shit up without any evidence whatsoever that such a thing is even possible. Then you made the entirely baseless assertion that your super genie can do whatever he wants without any rhyme or reason behind any of that, other than you apparently don't understand anything outside your field. You don't even have a field. You have a doctor of philosophy in the philosophy of science, which is a bit redundant. In other words, you have a PhD in having a PhD, but you have no practical education in anything you're talking about now, which is why you're always wrong about everything all the time. Yet, they invite people like you to be on TV shows like this. I guess that's because some of the folks who still watch television don't want to hear from anyone smarter than they are. Instead, the uneducated laity just want to feel good about what they've been foolishly made to believe. And that is the only reason why Stephen Meyer's books are bestsellers. Because indoctrinated rubes want to see that someone that they think is smart believes in the same stupid bullshit that they do. So they won't have to feel like they're that dumb, which also means that they won't learn the truth, which I think is the goal of all religious apologists, isn't it?